Hello everyone and welcome to AMA Resource People podcast, providing you a short Q&A style update on key workforce and employment relations matters relating to the resource and energy industry. I'm Tara Diamond, AMA's Director of Operations, and I'm joined by Tom Reed, Head of Policy and Public Affairs, and making his debut on our podcast is our special guest for today, AMA's Chief Executive, Steve Knott. Welcome to you both.
Welcome, Tara.
Let's get into it. I'm going to start with a question for you, Tom. Industrial relations policy has come roaring into the national conversation this week. Can you summarise for us what's it all about and what's been happening?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tara. So IR has been a hot topic pretty much throughout the COVID-19 crisis, but the government is now really looking to the post-COVID recovery phase. So the sort of reforms that are needed, not only to get people back into work as quickly as possible, but to sustain economic growth and employment growth and prosperity for the longer term. So it's very distinct from the COVID response changes, things like the variation processes, award variations, job seeker, job keeper, those sorts of things. We're really looking at more fundamental reforms. So that's very welcome, given that's obviously AMA's long-standing advocacy focus, employee relations and industrial relations. The Prime Minister announced on Tuesday that several working groups would be formed comprising multiple key stakeholders in the industrial relations area to come up with solutions to identified problems. So those being enterprise agreement making, casual employment, awards, compliance and enforcement, and greenfields agreements, which are new agreements primarily used for new projects such as major resources projects. So we're very much so looking forward to engaging in that process in good faith, collaboratively, and we'll see what comes out of it. But everyone's approaching this with a fair bit of positivity.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And the Prime Minister stressed on multiple occasions that these working groups were time-bound until September. So a question for you, Steve. How do you see this unfolding going forward? And do you have any comments about the representation on the 5 different working groups that Tom's described?
Sure. I think the representation on the groups, we've been in direct contact with key stakeholders in the government, and been at pains to impress upon them a different approach going forward, where you can pick people from the business community and other interest groups outside the traditional union representatives and employer representative groups, because to date that process has failed to bring about meaningful reform. So there are a number of people in our membership, CEOs of member companies, who would be ideal candidates to participate in some of those streams, whether it's the casual employment issue, the greenfield agreement issue, the project agreements that Tom spoke about, or indeed even the award and enterprise agreement approval processes. We have members who have first-hand experience of lengthy delays in getting their agreements approved, the challenge to get capital from unbelievably competitive international market at the moment, given the stimulus packages that are going on around the world. And the casual employment issue, at the end of the day, that issue needs to be resolved. And I think it will, but I can talk about that later if you like.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, that probably brings me to what we're seeing just explode in the media, with commentators characterising this process as an Accord version 2, referencing Bob Hawke government's Union Accord in the 1980s. Steve, a question to you, how accurate is this characterisation?
Well, it's a complete furphy. The reality is the media today, they don't have the depth of research capability to go back and analyse what actually happened. And so things become a bit folklore-like, and even business leaders I've seen come out and talk about this is a new accord and how the accord delivered wages growth. If you go back to the early 80s, there was a huge wages breakout in the manufacturing industry. There's 24% growth of wages, just wasn't sustainable. And because of the centralised wage fixing nature of our system back then, that flowed across the economy. 16% increase went across the economy. So what happened, and Paul Keating, who everybody knows had a good turn of phrase, he said to the bosses of the metalworkers at the time that they'll be carrying 100,000 dead men around their neck, because he could see these jobs were going to disappear. And of course, that's what happened. And so when Bob Hawke became Prime Minister in 1983, he inherited a situation where we had high interest rates. Some older people will recall 17.5% interest rates, double-digit unemployment, and we just weren't competitive. And so something had to change. We had high inflation as well, what they called stagflation. So what happened, the Accord Mark I, was really Bob Hawke going to talk to his former colleague at the ACTU, Bill Keldy, and say, hey, we can't sustain this anymore. So they actually put a brake on wages. And then they went through a process between 1983 and 1996. They had 8 accords, 7 were implemented. And the one that gets discussed a lot is enterprise bargaining, and that got implemented in 1991. But if you cover the field for that 13 years, that period, real wages growth actually went down. And it wasn't until the IR system freed up when employers could deal directly with their employees, and they could get creative and not do the Dolly Parton working 9 to 5 type thing, that things changed. And during the 11 years of the Howard era, real wages grew by over 20% and unemployment went down to 4.2% when Howard left office, or 3.9 if you take the lag effect. So since then, we've had this period of creative inertia where wages growth has been quite slow. Unemployment, even prior to COVID-19, was at unacceptably high level. We chose to have unemployment over 5%. So there's going to be about 20% of the workforce are underemployed or unemployed who are going to be looking in, trying to get into this new post-COVID-19 world. And one other quick comment, Tara, is that, and I've expressed this at the highest levels in government, the post-COVID-19 era, you will find that there will be less people, FTEs, in jobs in our industry because they've learned to do with less people during this crisis period. Their productivity levels are still the same. They're having less people going to sites. They've found ways to improve their productivity. They did this in the old days when there was a lot of strikes, that management would learn how to improve business processes. So that's the downside. On the upside, that's why the Greenfield Project Agreement issue is so important. We can see up to $100 billion worth of investments that could be made over the next 5 years, and direct and indirect employment of another 100,000 high-paid, well-earning jobs. So we've got to grasp that opportunity going forward. And I think some of these streams that have been set up by the IR Minister and the Prime Minister, they will bear some fruit in the agreement-making area, and I suspect they'll get some resolution on the casual employment issue, which is, those two issues are pretty important to our sector.
Yeah, well, let's circle back to the issue of casual employment. It is becoming more important following last week's Rosado decision. Can you explain why this is such a concern, the decision, not only for business, but for the entire economy?
Well, it should declare up front that the participants in the Rosado decision, and indeed the scheme decision 4 years earlier, are members of AMA, so we were quite close to it. When the first decision was handed down in 2016, the scheme decision, we were on the front page of the national dailies talking about double dipping, didn't pass the pub test. So that's the narrative that exists today. This latest decision, it reinforces the first decision, but also says that you have to pay the loading as well, the double dipping. So in our representations to government in 2016, we estimated the cost across the economy would be $8 billion. Now, some people estimate it will be higher than that. And so what will happen is, if that decision is not reversed in some way, particularly the double dipping, you'll have a conga line of businesses lining up to get the insolvency practitioners on board, and the public taxpayer will end up footing the bill through the federal government employee entitlement scheme, because the companies won't have the money to make the redundancy payments. They'll just go to the wall faster than Usain Bolt in full flight. So that is a real concern. So the ACTU are alive to that. Certainly the government is alive to that. And I think that coming together, there will be a meeting of minds where there is a formal process where casuals can convert to full-time employment. whether that's 12 months, 9 months or 6 months. And there'll be some accommodation reached at the offsetting provision where a loading's been paid, you'll be able to offset. So I think that's where it will land. I hope that's the case, but time will tell.
Well, let's hope so, because defining casual employment clearly needs to be a major priority in the process that we've just spent a couple of minutes talking about. To you, Tom, now, how do the other focus areas that the Prime Minister has outlined align to AMA's priorities for IR reform?
The short answer there, Tara, is quite closely. Just last week, actually, a few days before the Prime Minister addressed the National Press Club and announced this process on Tuesday, AMA did provide both the PM and also the Attorney General and Minister for Industrial Relations, Christian Porter, with our post-COVID industrial relations reform framework. So this is something that we worked up with, building upon AMA's long-standing advocacy and policy development in this space, but also talking to our members, including our board reference group and other stakeholders, about what are the key priorities for a post-COVID environment. So 4 of the areas actually align exactly. The one area that we didn't actively promote the Prime Minister last week was the compliance and enforcement area, but that is an area in which AMA has been advocating for many, many years, including through things like the Ensuring Integrity Bill, which we know has been put on pause for now. So our framework covered 3 main areas. The first one is agreement making. And of course, the major project agreements or the Greenfields agreements was one of the key priorities in that, but also things like a potential new individual statutory agreement-making option for employees and employers who are in employment relationships above a high income threshold of $132,000. So that's something that is really important to us, and I'm sure Steve will have some further thoughts on that today. Other areas, the second big area for us was really around simplifying the safety net. So been a lot of talk about award simplification, but we want to start really at, well, what do we need out of our safety net? Do we need to have a complex award system at all, or can we have a set of minimum standards of employment conditions, and then perhaps a set of around 19 individual industry-specific minimum wages? So essentially what that would look like is that all employment arrangements in the country are covered by a uniform set of minimum conditions and entitlements and allowances and these sorts of things, but the minimum wage between industries is the only thing that differs. And then the final area in our framework is really around this whole area of risk, cost, uncertainty, liability, just the fact that our employment system has really become a lawyer's picnic, and it's more costly, more risky, more legalistic to employ people in Australia than it ever has been. So there's a number of things in there. The casual employment issue is probably the most urgent, but also there's some significant uncertainty around personal leave entitlements that was brought about by another full federal court decision in the Mondelez case, and also looking at the unfair dismissal and the general protections provisions, which is a long-standing area of frustration and concern for employers in dealing with the Fair Work Act, just how unbalanced or imbalanced the employee protection system is. So in a nutshell, that's our 3 areas. They align very closely with what the government's looking at the moment, although of course there are a few areas where we've gone out with some interesting new proposals that we believe would really help the economy and employment in the post-COVID environment.
So Steve, Tom mentioned you might have some thoughts of agreement making. So let's go there now. This has been a long-standing area of concern for the resource and energy industry and our members. So can you summarise for us what the key issues are in relation to agreement making?
Well, so this will be a little bit different to what people hear elsewhere. The reality is 20 years ago, a lot of people in our industry were over enterprise bargaining. Now, people find that hard to believe, but there's only so many things that you can trade off. So essentially what happens in our industry is they go through 5 key areas. They want to make sure that people are safe at work. They want to make sure people are fairly treated. They want to make sure they're fairly remunerated. They want to make sure people are productively engaged, and they want to make sure their work is valued. So everyone's in the sector, because we've never been shielded from international competitive pressures, they just want to do a good job and improve the product and their productivity and so forth, and share in the benefits. So what's happened, and we've seen it economy-wide in the last 5 years, and you just have got to look at the numbers. There were 20,000 enterprise agreements 5 years ago, and we're down to 10,000 and falling. People are giving up because there's nothing to trade away at all. So they're not interested in that. And then on the other side, and I've got people sitting on my board, CEOs of companies that have had to wait 9 months to get an enterprise agreement approved. I'll use an example outside our industry that got a bit of attention. Actually, a former employee of ours was the deputy president that heard the matter in the first instance. That was an issue involving Kmart. So we have Phil Lowe, the Reserve Bank governor, saying business has got to give people a pay increase. In that case, they filed their enterprise agreement in December 2018. You would have thought it would have had an urgent stamp and been approved before Christmas. But the matter got heard after a lady called Amanda Mancini, who used to work for AMIT. She's our deputy president, and she didn't start for another 3 months. It finally got heard, and then it was subject to appeal. And the matter took 11 months before those workers got their pay increase. Now, you'll see cases like Wesfarmers with Bunnings. They had their enterprise agreement in the system for about 6 months, no progress, so they pulled out. So I've spoken to so many CEOs in our industry, and they're just they're fed up with the process. There's just too many interactions. Unions get involved even when they don't have any members. They have countless numbers of bargaining representatives. And at the end of the day, it's a process just to increase the pay terms and conditions. Now, good employers will do what they can to make sure people will stay in their business because they don't want to lose good employees. They want to make sure they're motivated. So it's an attract, retain, motivated type principle from a remuneration point of view. So we're so far past the enterprise bargaining era. But in small segments of our membership, they require an enterprise agreement. They're tendering for work and they need to know the principle that there'll be no legal industrial action. What is the cost of that project? And that's certainly the case too for greenfield projects when you're trying to get financial investment decision. You need that certainty. So they do enter into enterprise agreements for knowing what the costs are going to be and no industrial action when they're trying to mobilise plant and equipment, often from around the globe. So there is a role for enterprise bargaining and enterprise agreements, but in our sector, more so than not, they're just keeping outside the system. When they do go into the Fair Work Commission to get their agreements approved, some get turned around in 6 to 8 weeks, and others have been waiting 6 to 9 months. The service provision from the administrative tribunal, we have to remember the Fair Work Commission is not a court, it's an administrative tribunal. It's hit and miss.
Yeah, okay. Well, what about expanding agreement options then, such as a new form of individual agreement? Steve, perhaps I'll bat this one back to you. What place does that play in the resource and energy industry, having a new type of individual agreement?
Yeah, so we have to look at this through the prism that there's some things the government's going to be able to achieve in the short term. And the ACTU is effectively the opposition at the moment because if they agree to something, the government will likely to get Senate support for it. At the moment, they've got no hope of getting Senate support for any legislative change. So that's why I'm hopeful that common sense will prevail and the signals from the ACTU are positive, that they will support project greenfield agreement making. And also that there is a genuine desire, and I've been involved in COVID-19 task force the government's got in place on this. There's a genuine desire to resolve this casual employment issue, not just for our sector, but right across the economy. So I think in the short term, I'm hopeful that around footy's final time in September, October, there'll be some joy in those areas. But the other areas are making the case for the high income individual agreement side of making issue is the government's got to go into policy making mode before the next election. And I suspect those sort of things might fall in the considerations there more in the longer term, because we have a budget in November. And so that'll be a key focus when this review's completed and people are starting to look at the legislative framework. Groups that I sit on, the National Workplace Relations Consultative Committee, go and look at all the nuts and bolts of all of that. That'll all happen between now and the end of the year. After that, the government's going to move into another phase where they're getting ready, the Christmas, New Year break, and there's another budget on them in May. So if stuff doesn't happen this year, and I suspect the high income individual agreement making side of things will be a bridge too far for them, you're really into the policy consideration process for the next election. So we put that out there, and we're not it's not an unusual spot for us to be to promote reforms for an industry that pays and treats its people quite well. But we're realistic enough to know that that might be a longer term reform issue.
Okay, well, thanks for that insight and summary. That's really insightful. I'll come back to you now, Tom. There's been lots of public commentary around the safety net and specifically around, the modern award system. In AMA's view, what would simplification of that process look like?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, we are pushing the position that we shouldn't be starting with the award system. So this so-called modern award system has already been modernised a number of times. It's 116 years old, and it's the only one left in the world. And in addition to that, Australia's safety net is the only one in the world that's got this sort of weird 3 layers of red tape, being a national employment standards, which is effectively a minimum conditions of employment act. On top of that, an award system, and on top of that, enterprise agreement making. So rather than look at, say, simplifying the awards, which I imagine that's where a lot of the focus will be in these working groups will be, well, how do we look at the existing award system and take out a lot of the administrative burden and red tape that doesn't really offer anything for employment? It just creates more boxes to tick and forms to fill out and more process for process sake. I imagine that will be a lot of where the focus will be, and that could be a reasonable outcome in the end if those things are addressed. For example, this new system of rules for annualised salaries and this timekeeping that employers and employees are now being pulled into doing is just ridiculous. But AMA's view is that it would be a mistake to really just start with the modern award system, that we should instead think about what our safety net should be achieving and build it from the ground up. And the problem isn't that the award system assumes that different industries should have different minimum weekly wages. It's really that extraordinary level of detail, prescription, administrative requirements that's involved in getting us there. So, look, let's see where the process takes us, but AMA will certainly be pushing for a slightly more assiduous, strong reform narrative when it comes to the award system than perhaps the other business organisations will.
Okay. We're probably going to wrap up there, but I'd like to throw to you and to have the final word, Steve. Have you got any comments around, what's unfolded this week and what you think the priority for AMA and its members needs to be moving forward?
Well, before I do that, Tara, just a big shout out to our members from the get-go through this COVID-19 approach in terms of trying to find ways to keep their businesses going. It's been critically important to the economy. Now, the great people who have been speaking on this podcast, Tara and Tom, in terms of the engagement with the members and their willingness to share information, whether it's about evacuation procedures, testing equipment, FIFO arrangements, isolation. We've done an enormous job to keep things going, as has indeed the civil construction sector and other parts of the economy, but they're critically important. So the collective involvement of our membership has been awesome, and that's helped us inform our policy considerations going forward. And certainly we don't hide our light under a bushel. We put it out there what is needed in the reform area. And Tom talked about the award system side of things. What will happen now from a political reality point of view is they will tinker around with them and make them a little bit more simpler, particularly in the areas like hospitality and retail. Our awards aren't too bad because we spent over $1 million getting them right in the first place. And again, that was our membership support, the mining and the hydrocarbons award. But where it's been problematic in the current environment is we've had some people that in one part of the economy, they might be hospitality, catering, cleaning people who are in high demand at the moment, where they might want to move from, say, the mining sector into a hospitality or a public health area, and they get caught up with the different award arrangements and engagement principles and vice versa. So that's been problematic. So hopefully they'll work through some of those issues and make the mobility of labour, because we have something that's often lost sight of. 1/3 of our membership are in that services area. So they might be vessel operators, helicopter pilots, they might be camp, wet mess facilities, general cleaning, which, as you know, is going through the roof. Even though we've got less people on site, the cleaning arrangements have the ante there is almost doubled, if not more. So the mobility of people through the various award streams does have some significance in our sector. So I think they'll announce some teams coming forward in the next few days. There'll be some surprises as to who's on those 5 streams. We've certainly not been backwards in coming forward and recommending company-based people to go on those streams. So we're hoping to have some good people on those streams. And I think that will help facilitate some change. Some that will be good for our sector, and others that we continue to advocate for, well, we'll just continue to try and inch it forward in the months and years ahead.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your comments and insights today, Tom and Steve. Much appreciated. And thank you to our membership. And I'll echo Steve's thought. And we'll leave it there for today's edition of Resource People Podcast. Thank you.